Hello, and thank you for joining BlueSnap today for our webinar, The Final Countdown, How to Be PSD2 Compliant by the 31st of December. I'm April Grudier, Vice President of Marketing at BlueSnap and your host for today. Before we get started, a couple of logistics. First, we are recording today's webinar and we will send out a link to you post-event. Also, if at any time you have a question for our panelists, please submit your question in the question box to the right of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer everyone's question. If we're unable to do so during our panel, we will follow up with you post-event with an email. All right, let's get started. Today we're here to talk about PSD2 and the upcoming deadline, which seems to be an ever-moving target. We will be discussing what these new regulations are, their impact on merchants, and what businesses need to do in order to be fully prepared. Joining me today are two wonderfully insightful guests who can help us navigate this complex topic. First, we have Maggie Bodak from CardinalCommerce. Great to have you with us today, Maggie.
Thank you for having me, April.
Always a pleasure to meet with you. Maggie, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. First, I hope everyone is doing well under COVID-19. I've been working from home since March, but it's brought on some positive change both personally and professionally for me. I've been with Cardinal almost 10 years supporting authentication through 3DS1 and the new EMV 3DS protocols, with a focus of the past 3 years on PSD2 and SCA requirements. I help manage 9 program networks for 3DS globally and hybrid across merchant and issuers for support. So I'm happy to be here today and help answer some of these burning questions ahead of the deadline.
Great, thank you, Maggie. Also with us today is BlueSnap's Nikita Hyatt. Nikita, always happy to see you.
Hey, April, thank you for having me.
Of course. Nikita, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, of course. Hi, guys, I'm Nikita. I'm the Managing Director for BlueSnap Europe, based in the wonderful city of London. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, BlueSnap are a global payment provider. We exist to help merchants go local on a global scale through a single integration, and in doing that, reducing costs, increasing sales, whilst always remaining compliant. I've been working very closely with our excellent BlueSnap product team and our superb partners at CardinalCommerce to keep up to date on all things PSD2 and how it's going to impact you, our merchants, our partners, and also us as European shoppers.
Great, thank you. Thank you again to both of you for joining us today. Okay, so let's talk about our agenda. Please hold. It seems like I am having a little bit of technical difficulty. Moving to the next slide. All right, there we go. Thank you to Marielle, my technical wizard here. All right, for our agenda today, we're going to cover several topics. First, we're going to look at some e-commerce trends for 2020. Next, we're going to do an overview on PSD2 and Strong Customer Authentication. Then we'll move into discussing EMV 3D Secure for PSD2 SCA, and then wrap up with some questions. So Nikita, let's get started on some trends. What are we seeing in e-commerce in 2020, sorry.
Thanks, April. So in terms of the e-com trends we've seen this year, I think no one could have predicted that it would be such a roller coaster of a year. So we've seen an uplift in some areas and a decline in others. In terms of the uplift, we've seen sales in the regions of hundreds of % increases with our merchants selling arts and crafts and wines, the things that I see as the 2 parenting essentials during lockdown. Home office equipment, furniture, home decor have also seen huge uplifts in sales and demand. Another area, sporting goods. It was impossible to buy kettlebells in the UK once lockdown started, and I finally caved in and ordered a Peloton bike to boost these sporting goods sales. Another big shift has been in payment models. So more and more companies are looking at incorporating subscriptions into their business models, whether it's the local cafe branching out to an online fruit and veg subscription, beauty club memberships, or as I just mentioned, online fitness clubs. Subscriptions is an area that we have seen 46% growth in. And then there are the areas that have sadly suffered, and in some cases, irreparable damage because of the pandemic. Travel and tourism, and with that, the sale of luggage are all down, as are luxury goods, which in some cases are down as much as 70%.
So Nikita, tell us what exactly is PSD2?
Okay, thanks, April. So PSD2, or the Second Payment Services Directive, is the next iteration of EU payment legislation, and it expands on current legislation and regulations governing online payments. So if we rewind a little bit, PSD1, that was behind the creation of SEPA, a single euro payments area, and was also behind the removal of cross-border pricing between EU countries. Now, PSD2 was drafted back in 2015, published a year later in 2016, improved in 2018, and was supposed to come into effect September last year. Now, the target date for the EU is 31st of December, in the UK, 14th of September next year. There have been delays and more delays, but we expect these dates to remain in place. Now, PSD2 is centered around 3 points. One, secure customer authentication and how 3D Secure enables this SCA. The other one is marketplace regs. And then thirdly, open banking APIs. It's essentially legislation aimed at the payments industry and banking sector with the aim of driving payment innovation, but also maintaining data security. So our focus today, which Maggie will talk about more on the next slide, is on secure customer authentication, which is the area that will impact your businesses the most.
Great, thank you, Nikita. So Maggie, what is strong customer authentication and how does it relate to PSD2?
Yeah, let's talk about that a moment because that's all why we're here today, right? So what is SCA? So it is strong customer authentication. And in essence, it is a step up or a challenge. Those are terms that are widely used in the 3DS world today. But the European Banking Authority under PSD2 has taken two-factor authentication a little bit further. It's stepped in and defined criteria necessary for issuers or delegated authorities to meet 2 of 3 pieces of information. And this applies to possession, which is something the customer has, knowledge, which is something the customer knows, and inherence, which is something the customer is. When PSD2 and SCA go into effect at the end of the year, at its core, this means that SCA, meeting this criteria, is required on all remote commerce transactions that reside within the European Economic Area, or EEA, and also the UK in early 2021. Today's typical step-up or challenge method is a one-time passcode that's typically delivered via SMS from the issuer to the cardholder during their checkout process. In June 2019, the EBA indicated that this is not a viable method that meets 2 of the 3 criteria. So what's been happening? Issuers have been hard at work identifying and obtaining SCA compliant methods, which will focus on biometric authentication via a fingerprint or facial recognition, as recommended by most of the major card networks and their 3D Secure programs, specifically their EMV 3DS programs. After the first of the year, you'll begin to see this happen more frequently if you are shopping as a consumer. There could also be some fallback methods, such as one-time passcode in combination with a knowledge-based question in the event the customer has not enabled biometrics with their issuer. So this brings us to the question of who really needs to worry about this, right? So as we've mentioned, this is about the EEA. And so the answer to this question is fairly simple. Merchants who are acquired in the EEA, which is either, for example, UK, France, Ireland, Germany, and issuers who've issued cards within the EEA. This right here is what we call two legs in. The transaction is requested by a cardholder on a merchant with a card that is all contained within the EEA and the UK. Some examples of this is a UK cardholder making a purchase with a merchant with an acquiring relationship in Ireland, a German cardholder with the merchant in the UK, and so on. If one or more of the parts of the merchant, if one or more of the parts of this acquired relationship or the issuer is one leg out, it is considered out of scope. An example of this transaction would be a US cardholder making a request with a European merchant, or vice versa, a European cardholder purchasing at a US retailer. Simply put, these are examples and are your typical cross-border transactions. So April, let's roll into how EMV3DS helps with SCA. At the same time that PSD2 SCA regulations were being made public, Nikita outlined some of the steps that it took to get us here today in the timeline. EMV3DS was just taking off with version 2.1, and vendors, networks, merchants, and issuers were all getting ready to support it in the marketplace. These new and vastly improved 3DS protocols already display promising enhancements. The consumer experience is heightened by networks standing behind the application of risk-based authentication methods, which scores transactional risk by analyzing consumer buying behaviors, accounting for pre-existing reported fraud, checking the device's fingerprint, and utilizing rule functionality, possibly to determine if step-up is necessary. When stepping up, new authentication is leveraged with advanced technology like biometrics that we'll see under SCA. Now, authentication isn't just restricted to browser usage. We have expanded device data and device support that cover those in-app transactions initiated from mobile devices and supporting some Internet of Things use cases like TVs, consoles, or wearables. This really helps when PSD2 SCA needs to be applied in all remote type requests for payments as we move into the deadline. I mentioned issuers analyzing transactional risk, and this comes with the expanded data share that's now happening under EMV3DS. Finally, issuers are going to have viable data that really show them that I am who I say I am, what device I'm using, and the specific details about my purchase. This will also help PSD2 SCA by allowing issuers to apply their own exemption when a transaction risk is low, creating a frictionless experience for the cardholder. The final major bucket of enhancements that actually fall help regulatory needs like PSD2 and providing an expanded set of challenge flags for merchants. In version 2.2 of EMV3DS, this helps a merchant notify an issuer that they're using some of the exemptions outlined in PSD2 SCA. This might be requesting a challenge or no challenge, challenging because of the mandate that exists, acquirer transaction risk analysis, whitelisting, or even delegated authentication. So,
Right.
April, I think you have some burning questions, right?
Yeah, that is. Well, thank you for that great overview. It was extremely helpful. So yes, with PSD2 on the horizon, there are a lot of questions. And so we're going to be using Nikita and Maggie's expertise to see if we can provide some really clear and concise answers. So let's get started. Nikita, who is affected by these regulations?
Thanks, April. As Maggie mentioned, PSD2 Secure Customer Authentication applies to merchants processing payments in the European Economic Area. So a business or a merchant that is acquired in the EEA and that the shopper card is issued in the EEA That means if you're a merchant in Europe, acquired in Europe, and taking payments from a card that's been issued in Europe, 3D Secure Strong Customer Authentication applies to you.
Okay, Maggie, what are the benefits to the consumer with this new directive?
Sorry, I was muted there. So consumers can and ultimately will benefit in quite a few ways under PSD2 SCA requirements. Remember that the primary goal of PSD2 initiatives stretch well beyond SCA. As Nikita mentioned, it is a larger open banking initiative that's been around since the early 2000s. But contained within the SCA scope and more behind the scenes benefit to the shopper is the actual reduction in fraud and added security of their payment. In combination with EMV 3DS, this will validate, like I mentioned, that I am who I say I am, regardless of what device I'm transacting with, regardless of who I'm shopping with. My issuing bank will now have necessary and much needed data behind my purchase to be confident and agree that it's me that's trying to make that purchase. This confidence then also can trickle into the approval of the purchase when shopping remotely. If it's done right, the issuers and the decisions that they're making by using the expanded data in authentication is then shared with their authorization systems. And this can lead to more approvals and less false declines. There's nothing worse than having money or the credit line available to make the purchase and getting declined for fear of fraud or lack of insight into the transaction with my actual bank. No one wins with that. The merchant loses the sale, the customer may go somewhere else, and the customer may choose to pull their card from another wallet. So SCA does need to be delivered in the EEA, like we've talked about. Consumers will have the added benefit of using the new technology, as we mentioned, with biometrics that falls in line with use cases that we see today. If you're a consumer who's mobile savvy, you'll see 2FA take place on any major company's app when logging in order to access your account. So this will align the user experiences with the across the board with the safe and secure message and types of authentication that's happening. Exemptions will also benefit consumers when exemptions are applied appropriately and the issuers choose to accept them. The consumer will benefit by a seamless interaction and approval from their bank. So when this happens, and there is a frictionless experience, SCA would be suppressed. Trusted beneficiaries can also benefit the consumer because they can actually acknowledge that they trust the merchant that they're shopping with and make that known to their card issuer.
Great. So it sounds like there's going to be impact all around. So Nikita, can you tell us how will PSD2 impact merchants and issuers?
Yeah, sure. It's all connected to what Maggie was just saying. And so one thing about 3D Secure 1, it has always, I suppose, had a bit of a mixed reception and response from merchants and shoppers. So in regions where it's common practice, it's seen as a great way to prevent fraud, shift liability away from merchants. But some merchants with 3DS1 can sometimes see it as a bit of a friction point in the seamless customer journey. So the pop-up redirect can result in higher abandonment, and in countries where shoppers traditionally aren't familiar, merchants sometimes would rather take the fraud risk than the risk of losing the shoppers. But now, thanks to the new flow, the 3D secure journey will be significantly improved and in some cases seamless. So merchants have to share more information with the issuer, which means that the issuer is getting significantly more data points, and sometimes the customer might not even be challenged because all the information is already there. This is a better shopper journey, a reduction in abandonments, a liability shift, and ultimately an increase in conversion and sales. So in turn, the issuers are receiving more information. Like I said, the additional card not present data elements, there are significantly more in 3DS2 compared to 3DS1. So the issuers are better informed when they make their decisions and are making these decisions with more confidence than ever. Now, I know there's been some bad press recently around secure customer authentication. There was one article I saw this week claiming something like 25 to 35% abandonment and dropouts and all of these things. Now, I think these figures are a little unfair and misleading. 3D secure technology, 3DS1, that's not new technology. 3DS2, that flow has already started coming into place. So many countries have started introducing the flow. Merchants have started testing the waters. And once it's mandatory, shoppers will be expected to go through the 3D secure journey. And because of these new additional data points, we expect the length of time to be reduced, not increased. And bear in mind as well, if the issuer isn't ready for 3DS2, there is the fallback of 3DS1. So, so we expect this to be a positive in the journey, not a negative.
Okay, so what are the implications for businesses?
So, I mean, the implications, it's pretty simple. The issuer is going to decline any transactions after the 31st of December that should have gone through strong customer authentication. And that is a law. So basically, if the issuer does not decline the transactions because they have not gone through secure customer authentication, they're in violation of the law. So I think if you're a merchant doing business in Europe and the cardholder is using a card issued by a European issuer, that transaction needs to go through secure customer authentication and you need to be ready for it. If you're not compliant by the deadline, your transactions will be declined.
Okay. Now, Maggie, what can merchants expect to happen on the 31st of December, and how does EMV 3DS help them comply?
Yeah, thanks, April. I think we've talked a little bit about that in a sprinkle of everything through this webinar already, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, as we approach this enforcement date and the ecosystem starts to ramp up, we understand that the key priority coming out of holiday and everything is for merchants to continue to grow their sales and provide that seamless consumer experience and really run their business. By the end of this year, SCA compliance will become foundational for any business operating in Europe. Nikita just mentioned it and touched on it. Merchants are strongly advised to adopt the highest version of EMV 3DS that is provided by their acquirer, gateway, or solution provider in time for December 31st and that Jan 1 date. You should already be marching towards this, right? And implementing and testing. Once the deadline is reached, all remote commerce transactions, as I mentioned and Nikita mentioned, do need to have SCA attached to it or an exemption noted during either the authentication request or authorization process. And if that exemption is noted, it needs to be accepted by the issuer. If the exemption is not accepted, SCA is required. If the transaction goes to authorization without these steps taken, a soft decline could occur, indicating SCA is needed before approval of that transaction. I think it's good to hear this multiple times because it is so key to European payment processing. The SCA requirement again means that the electronic payment must be secure, guaranteed that the buyer is authenticated safely, and the risk of fraud is reduced out of the ecosystem. Though the law specifically didn't state 3D Secure is the ultimate answer, the networks have chosen to stand behind their programs that they have today for 3D Secure and really promote these new enhanced protocols because there's so much technology that sits behind them now. And so at minimum for merchants, it's about implementing 3DS and laying the rails for the issuers to deliver that SCA to their cardholder. For issuers, it's about having that SCA compliant solution ready. So By this time, merchants should already be working on or wrapping up their strategy for payment processing and flows that they'll use to request exemptions, handle potential soft declines. For merchants that are out there, it translates to using EMV3DS prior to authorization, delivering those SCA flows to cardholders when necessary and on behalf of the issuers. And really, provide that solid payment processing flow with minimal interruption and friction to the cardholder.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, Nikita, how is BlueSnap helping businesses become PSD2 compliant?
So BlueSnap offer a number of different ways for merchant to integrate to us, and I want to say that all of them are 3D secure ready. But ultimately, it's pretty straightforward. Businesses need to enable 3D secure or code to 3DS, depending on their integration. BlueSnap's payment API provides built-in support for 3DS, and our 3DS, which we've built with CardinalCommerce, meets all SCA requirements. Now, if you're a merchant using our hosted pages, then there is no coding you have to do. BlueSnap take care of initiating that authentication request as part of our hosted solution. And also, one thing I want to say is our 3DS solution will automatically fall back on 3DS1 if the issuer isn't ready.
Okay, great. Now, Nikita, are the regulations affecting marketplaces and ISVs? And if so, what are the payment impacts?
So PSD2 impacts payments, which means marketplaces and ISVs are most definitely in scope. So for marketplaces, that regulation is in effect today. Marketplaces, as we know, collect payments from buyers and distribute those funds to sellers in a marketplace. Now, this activity is regulated in the EU under PSD2, meaning that a marketplace should not have possession or control of funds, and if they do, they need a license to operate. So you basically need a payments license if you're a marketplace and in possession or control of funds that need to be dispersed to sellers in your marketplace. So where BlueSnap helps here is that we have a marketplace functionality. So we do all of the payouts to sellers in your marketplace. And since we are paying the sellers, we also do KYC and AML to all of the sellers in the marketplace. So we remove you from the payment process and allow you to be compliant without needing to obtain a payments license. Now, in terms of our ISVs, we've reached out to all of our ISVs and made them aware of PSD2 and the regulation. Typically, a software vendor is the application that is initiating the payments for a merchant. So if you are an ISV and you are initiating payments for a merchant, some of those transactions are going to be in scope and you have to deploy 3D Secure in your framework.
Okay, great. Now, Maggie, I hate to say this, but what if I'm a business and I haven't thought about PSD2 and Strong Customer Authentication? Where do I start?
Oh, thanks, April. You know, it just makes me a little nervous. PSD2 and SCA, we've talked about it. It's been around in the market. People have been buzzing about it. Opinions have been released on it. A little bit more clarity has been provided since the initial RTS publication. And it's been almost 4 years now. And with the previous enforcement date that dates back to September 14, 2019, at this point, I really hope that merchants have already started and are nearing that finish line for the December 31st date. Again, I want to reiterate that merchants are really strongly advised to support that latest version of EMV3DS that's available from the respective card networks as well as their provider. Nikita talked a little bit about BlueSnap and the implementations that are available today. And if merchants are unable to perform that authentication after the 31st deadline, this really could result in the loss of sale as well as a poor customer experience. So to start implementing 3DS and securing payments to comply with SCA requirements, merchants should follow these steps. You know, 1, talk to your acquirer, work with your 3DS provider and identify what implementation methods are available, like Nikita had mentioned for BlueSnap merchants. Is it going to be a browser-based JavaScript? Is it going to be an API-based solution? Do you have a native application and you need authentication within that native app? Determine the authentication information that you need to send. You know, do you have normal buy delivery orders? Do you have recurring or installments? Do you have MIT transactions? All of these make an impact. So review your business model accordingly and find that nice payment stack for you. Implement and validate EMV 3DS. And then, of course, always monitor and optimize. You know, this isn't an end all be all or a set and forget, especially if you yourself are applying some risk factors to the payment transaction. So, you know, always keep that reduction in fraud top of mind.
Okay, great. Now, Nikita, can you tell us about the exemptions for low value transactions?
Yeah, so there is an exemption for low value transactions, i.e. if the transaction is under 30 euros, it qualifies, but that's really only one piece of the puzzle. The real exemption is if it's under 30 euros, but also it must not be a maximum of 5 consecutive transactions or a cumulative limit of over 100 euros. So obviously you as a merchant can ask for an exemption, but because this exemption is by PAN, i.e. by credit card number, it's really only the issuer that knows whether there have been 5 consecutive transactions on that card or if the cumulative limit is over 100 euros, because transactions may have taken place in businesses other than yours. So as an example, I was at the start of all of this, I was speaking to a merchant. It's a well-known subscription merchant where the average monthly subscription is around the kind of 10 to 15 euro mark. And then when they heard about the low value exemption, they were like, great, that's us sorted. But I explained to them what I just told you, that this exemption is per PAN, not per transaction. So it doesn't mean the issuer will grant it, because there are those other 2 components that will be taken into consideration.
Okay, great. Now, Maggie, when is strong customer authentication applicable to reoccurring transactions?
Yeah, so recurring transactions can be in scope. There's that first initial transaction in the recurring series of the same amount and every time that's going to happen on a regular cadence that needs to go through SCA as that agreement is being placed between the merchant and the consumer or cardholder. The consumer will be present for this step up or SCA activity that needs to take place. So it's imperative to have that happen while you have the consumer's attention and readiness at the checkout. But subsequent transactions in the series, as long as they're coded and identified up front that this is going to be recurring, under EMV 3DS, this is under 3RI. Those are not required to be authenticated or SCA applied, but you know, it offers a couple benefits down the road with the 3RI support functionality. It allows the merchant to send in details about the recurring agreement that includes the purchase date that's original to the agreement, the frequency of the transaction. So is this going to happen on a monthly basis, for example? And then the expiration date of that recurring agreement. Does it end 6 months from now or does it end a year from now? Subsequent transactions can use EMV 3DS rails in order to obtain that cryptogram or the CAVV or AAV value that's necessary for authorization, and it can also be used to tie the subsequent authorizations back to the original authentication that was requested when the agreement was made.
Okay, great. Now, Nikita, what happens to all the existing tokens and what is the impact on a customer's auto renewal?
Okay, so I think there are kind of two bits to this question and two things going on here. Firstly, in terms of auto renewals, I think here we're talking about subscriptions that happened before the 31st of December. So in the new world, as Maggie explained, the first subscription transaction goes through 3D Secure. Subsequent transactions are out of scope. They are considered merchant-initiated transactions. But what about the subscriptions that started before the regs kicked in? Now, those are what are being called grandfathered subscriptions. So if it started before the end of December, it's being grandfathered. And BlueSnap look after the logic and how to do this and the network IDs and passing that on so that that grandfathering takes place. Now, the other part of the question is about existing tokens. Now, this is sometimes known as vaulted shopper, card on file. So it's when you've tokenized a card for one of your customers and that card holder is coming back online and they are a returning shopper using a card that you have stored for them. Now, that is not a merchant-initiated transaction. That is not a subscription. It's a CIT, a customer-initiated transaction. So if you have a returning shopper scenario, that customer must go through 3D Secure again.
Okay. Now, Maggie, what about non-EU companies that offer worldwide online sales? How does PSD2 affect them, and what do they need to do in order to be compliant?
Yeah, thanks, April. Really, it's regardless of where your merchant business is incorporated or domiciled, it's really about your acquiring relationships. If you're AP or LAC or North America merchant with no acquiring affiliation in the European Economic Area, then PSD2 does not apply to you to those typical cross-border transactions. In terms of this example, the transactions are out of scope and considered one leg out instead of those two legs in. I do want to say, though, that however, implementing EMV3DS should be applied to these transactions in a best effort basis to gain wider approval rates and reduce fraud as well as those false declines. 3DS has been widely used in Europe as well as other mandated countries across the globe. And those issuers in those countries are used to seeing 3D secure data elements attached to their authorization requests. They like to know that the transaction has been authenticated by them or in a network stand-in attempt to authenticate. So I would encourage merchants who are doing cross-border sales to the EEA that they do implement EMV3DS, use the new technology, take advantage of the risk-based authentication that can come with that, the new authentication methods that are available if necessary to step up and engage with the consumer, and use that best effort to really show that you're reducing that fraud.
Great. So thank you, Nikita and Maggie, for your really insightful answers to these questions. Now, we do have a few audience questions which came in, so we're going to take a few of those. The first audience question, again, it's a clarifying question. I think, again, because the deadline's been a moving target, it begs for clarity. The question is, I have heard the UK is extending the deadline to support PSD2 until 2021 in September. Is this correct? Maggie, can you help clarify this one more time for everyone?
Yeah, Nikita talked about this a little bit. I briefly mentioned it, but although the UK is, separated, it's still complying with PSD2 and SCA rules. So since the beginning, they've always taken a little bit of a secondary approach to the deadline. When the original date was September 14th of 2019, the UK was already shooting for 6 months later for March of 2021. There have been a few other delays. We've had COVID impacts, and the UK Financial Conduct Authority really took a separate stance and said, hey, we're going to shift our date by 6 months. So now we're targeting for a September 14, 2021 date in the UK. But I do want to just make sure, and it's important to know that if there's anyone that's from the UK directly on this call today, as a card holder and when you're a consumer, and you are making purchases with merchants outside of the UK, but still contained within the EEA, they could experience SCA earlier than September of 2021 because these other countries are deploying as of December 31st, Jan 1 timeframe. So it's just the reversal of this. If you're a card holder that's got a Irish issued card and you're shopping with a UK based merchant, I'm sorry, I apologize, getting a little bit confused here, but if you're a UK card holder and you're shopping with a merchant that's domiciled in a different country, your issuer is not going to step up and engage you yet. That'll come closer to that September deadline for the UK.
Okay, great. Next audience question. And it's around prompts, display prompts. So I would like to know more information on how the prompt will display to users and how they get their authentication codes. Maggie, can you answer this question?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier before, biometrics should be leading the forefront and should be the primary authentication method used by issuers. It does meet the 2 of the 3 criteria for SCA that's defined by the EBA. This may look different across issuers and their ACSs based on how they've implemented, but a standard flow would consist of the cardholder initiating the purchase, which kicks off that authentication request to the issuer, and then the issuer starting to prompt that challenge or that SCA session, depending on if the transaction begins from a browser or from a mobile device. Remember, in-app, we've got that SDK element with EMV3DS. The actual experience can vary, but in a nutshell, the consumer is going to get that prompt from their mobile device to authenticate themselves with the biometric that they've enabled with their card issuer. And that's typically going to be done through a mobile banking application, but it can look a little bit different as well, depending on the solution that's implemented by the issuer. Once the purchase is confirmed and it's valid, and yes, I've authenticated myself, I want to proceed, then the consumer would then be, prompted to complete their checkout process with the merchant in their existing session and, receive their order confirmation page.
Okay, great. So I think we have time for one last audience question. This question is around subscriptions. So the question is, do subscription-based merchants need to ask for SCA for both trial and first monthly payment in case the trial payment was a small amount followed by a regular higher monthly subscription amount? Nikita, can you help us with this question?
Yep, sure. So, so the kind of general rule is that when the shopper is online, then they are in scope to perform strong customer authentication. So in this scenario, if the first payment is, say, €1, it will go through the 3D secure flow. But for any subsequent transactions, provided they are being initiated by the merchant and not the customer, not by the customer going online and requesting the payment, as long as that's not happening and it's the merchant that's initiating the transaction, they will be out of scope.
Okay, great. Well, again, Nikita and Maggie, thank you for joining us today and speaking to us about PSD2. Your answers were extraordinarily helpful and insightful. And thank you to our audience for listening in. We hope we were able to provide more understanding about PSD2 and how it impacts you. Again, for our audience questions that we didn't get to, we will follow up with responses via email. And don't forget, we will be providing you a link of this recording shortly. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to Maggie and Nikita, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks very much.